Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
I will be asking questions. Each presenter will present for 5 minutes each. So I'll get that going, and maybe we'll start with Anna Marie. If we are not our resumes, what are we? I just read your resume.
I was going to say.
So it really, isn't that a mixed message? So what are we? What according to your worldview is a human being? So that's a tough question, so I'll let you start.
Well, actually, some of you may have read this weekend, actually, perfect timing. There was a really good piece by David Brooks that talked about the moral bucket list. And in that piece, he distinguished between basically your resume and what he called your eulogy resume. Your resume is, what you present when you want a job, what you present when you're running for a position. And it lists your accomplishments, but your accomplishments in terms of maybe traditional measures of success, what positions you've held. And your eulogy resume is, what they're going to say about you when you die. And I think that we've all kind of occasionally had that fantasy, gone to someone else's funeral and heard what they say about them and wondering, what will they say about you? And at a eulogy, it usually isn't about so-and-so held this position. What we talk about more often there is, this person was courageous, they were caring, they were compassionate, they were a good brother or sister, a good father, a good mother, a good grandfather. And it's much more about what you did than what position you held. And I think that that's really, I know that I try and approach my own life very much that way. Not I want this job or that job, but what is it that I want to accomplish? And sometimes a position may help you accomplish that, but it really is about what you want to do, not just, what you hold. And I think that, at the end of the day, and there have been people who have studied, what do people say on their deathbed? And usually it isn't, I wish I'd spent one more day in Olympia. As important as that might be. On the other hand, and so that's where the relationship is, they might well say, I was able to help students get access, and I could change students' lives. And so that's where those things that, I think that it's not a question, we can really get into, I think at times, being a little cynical and saying the resume doesn't matter at all. But I think that, what's important is how are they linked? It's not that I spent a day in Olympia, but was I able to accomplish something by being there? Was I able to use my talents, my positions, some of which might have happened by chance, to do something rather than just to hold it and feel comfortable being there? And I think that, that's the way I kind of think about it.
Charles?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here. Thank you for arranging the rain. You probably know in California we've had a drought for a long time. So you kind of tend not to be very gracious or grateful for the things you see every day. And over in California, we like the sight of rain. So actually, it's the reason I am here is because I have noticed over time, over the last few years, that when I go to different campuses, there is really a need to ask this question: who am I beyond a resume? When I first came across this title, it was actually as part of a article in the Stanford Online Daily. A student wrote, "You are not your resume," and he reflected on the fact that, oh, gee, just because we are at the school prestigious, we can call it UW, that doesn't make me a good person. In fact, he says, we do all these things to enhance our sort of marketability to people, but at the end of the day, we are more than, we ought to be more than that. He reflects on this issue, and then he says, oh, well, what is it then? What is this thing, amorphous thing we call being good? And then he goes on and says, well, I guess, the decision is simple. I can strive for moral and personal perfection, or I can get a tan and wear a flashy shirt. So which choice is more likely to draw people to me and improve my social status? Sorry, this is a Stanford student here. In terms of outcomes, it seems that being a good person is overrated, or at least that is how the logic goes. This might not be so problematic if it weren't for the fact that the two options become confused at some point. Investing my resume of appearances and achievements is evidently not looked at as a substitute for being a good person. But what is this thing, this amorphous notion of being good really means? He ends up saying, I have no idea. My bad. I hope nobody who's reading this waiting for the answer. He was asking such great questions, and then you get to this point and say, what happened? And he says, I hope no. So he says we need to teach ourselves at the end of the day, going to Stanford or UW does not necessarily mean that we are good people, we're just smart people. And he was reflecting on this one issue that one of his professors brought up. And the professor was referring to this article called The Disparity Between Intellect and Character. And this article is by a Harvard psychiatry professor, Robert Cauce. And Robert Cauce was describing an encounter in which a student was working her way through college, happened to be at Harvard. She approached him distraught with this problem that she can't figure out. How can successful, motivated students with straight A's still act like jerks? In her case, she was from the Midwest, and she had worked her way through college. And she was working in the dorms, and she noticed that some of the people who were in the dorms were rude, in fact, crude to her. And she was propositioned by one of her classmates repeatedly. She came to talk to this professor because this young man gets straight A's in the ethics class. And she says, I get C's, he gets A's. If we were to write an essay on how to behave, he would just absolutely kill it. And why is it that people who ought to know better don't behave better? And why is there such a gap between our capacity for moral reasoning and our capacity for moral living? I think these are important questions. We want to ask the question of who am I other than my resume? Because, if you wrestle with the important questions in life, you will always end up asking, what is virtue? What does it mean to be good? Those are harder questions than, how do I be happy? But the two cannot be separated. The pursuit of happiness cannot be separated from the pursuit of virtue. If you try to do that, you'll find yourself in this selfish corner in which you have neither. So it's worthwhile that we spend time, I think, asking these questions today.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Charles. So I think both of you come from fields in psychology and in economics, and I was thinking, what is your understanding of a human identity based on those fields? And what does true success, how is that defined in terms of those fields? Maybe Charles, you want to, we were talking about this a little bit in terms of the study of economics and the human condition. You were talking to me about that. It was fascinating.
I'm trying to figure out what it was that I said. So I do think, so let's think a little bit about success, right? What do we mean by success? Is success a good thing? Yeah, so who doesn't want to be successful? You just raise your hand, let me know. Right? We all want to be successful, but what about being a successful thief? Or a successful liar? Or successful terrorist? Right? When we think about success, we are thinking about it in the context of a set of goals. Success is merely the attainment of a set of goals. The real question in life is, how good are your goals? How worthwhile are they? And to do that, you have to spend some time thinking about bigger issues, commitments to a more metaphysical commitment to reality. It's sort of this cogent worldview that would help you to ask, what are the goals that are worthwhile in life? The success of a knife is to cut because it was designed to cut. The success of a racehorse is to run because it was bred to run. What is success for a human being? It depends really on what you think a human being is and why we are here. For me, I'm a Christian. I believe that I've been created. So when I search for meaning, I should begin by asking, what do I know about God? What might He want me to do? And for me, I wasn't born a Christian. I became one when I was 24. And that was a radical experience in my life, which really changed me around. So when I think now in terms of success, it's not so much an economic view. I know you were talking about I just think in terms of what happened and what it meant for me. It's been said, and I tell my PhD students, that you always learn the most from the things that are most surprising. So in other words, if you want to learn something salient in your discipline, look for things that don't fit the orthodoxy. Okay? Think of the anomalies that don't fit the paradigm because they usually tell you the most about the world. For me, in human history, the biggest surprise is the life, acts, death, and I believe resurrection of Jesus. And to me, that was the biggest surprise in human history. And in my own life, the biggest event was the fact that I actually believed it. Because I didn't think that that was something that someone like me would ever believe. So when I think about what success is now for me, it's very difficult for me to think of it without reference to that experience and that reality that I have become a part of.
Anamari, so success. What would you tell these UW students true success might look like?
Well, let me talk about that a little bit in terms of my field, which is psychology. And I think that for a very long time, psychology focused almost exclusively on problems, particularly on mental illness and all the ways, things like, and I think that happiness or success was the absence of things like depression, anxiety, worry, etc. And I think that psychology really took a very different turn probably about 20 or 30 years ago and started looking at more of the positive aspects of life so that happiness or fulfillment or meaning are more than the absence of these negatives. And I think that right now there's a real area of psychology that I find very intriguing that is trying to grapple with what are the similarities and what are the differences between happiness and meaning. Because I think in the end, success isn't about the number of places you've been or the number of boxes that you've checked, but what you've taken from them, what you've brought home from them. We can all think of people who have been all over the world and, quite frankly, gotten very little from their journey, because it really, if it's Monday, it must be Paris. And, it's like, they're just going through and checking, that bucket list off. And then there's other people that can, take a trip to the other side of the state and get involved in something meaningful and meet people different than they are. And that's a much more powerful journey for them. In terms of my own upbringing, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. And so I was very much raised in that tradition. And I do feel like that kind of moral grounding that you get from a religious education is very much a part of me now. although I can describe myself as a recovering Catholic, or whatever word you want to use, although Pope Francis may well get me back. I have an enormous admiration, and even though a church is not its leader, it's been very surprising to me about how, when you really have a good leader that talks about the real virtues in the religion, all of a sudden you view it differently. When I was in college, I also did some studying of Eastern religions, partly as an intellectual experience. But there's a psychologist that I think highly of. His name is Ken Wilber, who has really tried to distill what is it that all religions have in common, that all forms of spirituality have in common. And it's kind of interesting. One of the things, of course, is the belief in spirit, that there's something called spirit. Different people, some people, can call it God or Jesus, and but that there's something about spirit and that it actually exists. The other part of it is that even though it's out there, it's something else, that we find it in here. And all spiritual systems also have that in common. Another commonality of them is they talk about, if you think about it as the Adam and Eve story, that we can be in this fallen state. And what's a fallen state all about? Well, a fallen state is about being too much distracted by material things, the apple, or being too distracted by yourself, in the selfish sense of the word yourself. And so almost every spiritual system has a number of practices that help us break out of that fallen sense and get beyond that selfishness or that material world that surrounds us. Meditation, prayer, which is a form of meditation, yoga, psychotherapy even. It's, that there are methods that can take us out of that selfishness or that material world. What's interesting is that at the end of it, the path out of that is, time and again, it's very much the same thing, which is it brings you to the world of others, the world of community, the world of serving others, and of we being bigger than me. And so I really think that there's something in that's what success is all about, that sense of enlightenment, of getting out of yourself. And it's interesting because some of the work that's being done on happiness, I particularly like the work of a fellow named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he talks about flow, those peak moments, those moments when you most feel alive. And they come when you're doing something really difficult that stretches you and that takes you out of yourself, something that gives you meaning beyond yourself. And I think it's those moments, that's what success is all about. It's, getting outside of yourself into a world of others. And I think that any sense of spirituality can take you there, and that we do have an amazing amount of similarity in terms of the ways to get there.
Thank you, Anna-Mari. I think there is a lot of Francis Catholics now, so thanks very much. The next question, and I'm going to ask you, is what advice from your perspective would you give to students in handling failure? I think that's a very tough thing for anyone to handle, and I'm wondering what advice would you offer?
Well, I think that one of the things, it was interesting because in the same New York Times, I was actually flying home on a plane, and so I got to read the paper, which I don't always do, that was that article about the moral bucket list. There was also an article last week that had the education life piece that was about young people, a little bit younger than yourselves. Actually, it was done in the Bay Area, and they were talking about basically young people in Palo Alto and a rash of suicides. And apparently there's been a number of them, and they often seem to be around failure. And failure meaning they didn't get into Stanford. And that being enough to apparently for some young people who have been bred in this hyper-competitive environment to make them think that it's not worth it. And one of the things that I do worry about, and that we are trying to do somewhat differently here, is not just, some of these highly competitive schools, it's like you have to have decided when you were 5 years old that you were never going to fail. Because that's the only way you're going to get in. And I think that that's crazy, and I think that that's not the way that you select future leaders and the future people that are going to change the world, because I think that failure is often the first step towards success. If you look at most people who have achieved something really large, they've had to have taken risks. And when you take risks, sometimes you fail. What I really hope that we can do here is provide the kind of environment that when you fail, we can have the supports there to help you then lift yourself back up and back on the path towards success. But I think if you look at failure, again, think about life as not a destination or a career as a destination, but rather as a journey. And when you undertake anything difficult, at times you really are going to stretch yourself. The plane that I was on, I was at a conference at UCLA on Latinos in math. And I was asked to talk to that conference, and there was a bunch of high school students and undergraduates there as well. And I talked about how the very first statistics class that I took in graduate school, this was at Yale, and at Yale no one fails. So what they do is they give you grades that are, there's honors, high pass, pass, and pass is fail. Okay, and I got a pass, which is the equivalent of a C, on my very first statistics class. And it scared the heck out of me because I'd done very well as an undergraduate, and it just really redoubled my efforts. And actually the second stats class that I took, not only did I get an honors, but the paper that I wrote for the class ended up getting published. And I often think I don't think that would have happened if I had gotten a B in the class, because I would have just gone along and probably gotten another B. So I really think that failure, you can think of it as a gut check. They are those moments when you see what you're made of. Actually, the very first administrative position that I ever put my hat in the ring for, it was for the position that Ed Taylor now holds. It was Dean for Undergraduate Education. I didn't get. So, I think failure, my mom says if it doesn't kill you, it only gives you calories. I don't need any more calories, but, if failure doesn't kill you, and it shouldn't, although apparently for some people it has, it will only make you stronger, but you have to get yourself back up.
Thank you. Charles, on failure. How do you deal with it?
Okay. Well, so this situation across the track from Stanford really is a very serious one. We have had the most recent one was in March. This young man, 15 years old, killed himself. And it's not that we haven't recognized that this is a problem. If there are ways to deal with this. The Palo Alto school system has counselors, nutritionists, statisticians who analyze the amount of homework people are doing. We have guards now at all of the crossings where people are committing suicide, fences. There is an enormous effort to try to deal with this issue of if I don't succeed, there is nothing left. But I do think there's something very important that and President Cauce named it, which is the role of spirituality, the role of faith, what we call a soul. We are not addressing a very large part of what it means to be a human being in the curriculums of campuses now. Maybe because it's a little sensitive, maybe because people feel like, well, we all have different views. But we're not even having conversations about the legitimacy of such needs. And I think this is a serious problem, because even when these are 15 to 18-year-olds, 3 out of the last 4 were Asian. They are very young. And there's this heart-wrenching article that recently, that was written by one of the students. It's called The Sorrows of the Paula Alton. She was describing how even in elementary school, they were channeled into sort of the smart track and the dumb track. They don't call it the dumb track, but if you're not on the turbo track, you know which track you're in. So we find that even you know, the entire society is reflecting on this issue of where is the failure. I think a lot of it has to do with us asking ourselves, who are we? What is a human being? The Bible tells us that we are more than the sum of our atomic parts. Right? So there is something that's really important to us, part of our identity, called our soul. And so Genesis would say God formed man out of the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostril the breath of life, and he became a living soul. Meaning that you're more than the sum of your parts. It's not just all the pieces, all the atoms that form you, that there is something else in you that is in fact more important in many ways. In fact, if I were to summarize what Jesus says about possessions and about money, about success, it would be what it is not. It's like almost 1 in every 10 verses in the New Testament is about what it is not. And he keeps coming back to the point that there's something in you more important than that. He says, well, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? What can a man give in exchange for his soul? What he is trying to do, and it seems we have a tendency to forget it because he keeps repeating it, is that there is something that's much more important, that gives life meaning, that tells you something about, that's not in just matter and energy. It's telling you something very fundamental about what makes life worth living. Things like beauty, justice, friendship. These things are things that make life worth living. And they aren't tested in test tubes. There's questions we need to ask ourselves. And they are the questions that I found in my framework was answered through my faith.
You know, I think you made a very important point there, is that sometimes we let our various religions separate us. And so we don't want to talk about them, because if I talk about mine, I'm saying something different about yours. But in fact, there are some enormous commonalities there in terms of what it is that makes a life worth living, and what it is that gives worth to life. And I think that sometimes it really does make sense. I love the fact that we're sitting here and talking about it, because I think that there's a lot more there in common in terms of that sense of spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it, but that sense that you're more than your skin and bones and blood and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, particularly students, you're at the age where those questions have to be burning questions, because, you know, this is, like I say, I work with adolescents, and that sense of who am I and who do I want to be are the critical questions that you're asking. And it's not that your careers, et cetera, aren't important. They absolutely are. We do know that when people are too poor and too downtrodden, it does interfere with finding meaning, because if you're just focusing on your next meal, it's very hard to lift yourself too far above that. But it's not, it really is, what do you want to do with your life, and who do you want to be, not just, you know, exactly what career are you going to have or what school are you going to get into. That should be a means to an end, not the end in and of itself.
Thank you. Charles, thinking about the relationship of success to happiness, if one is successful, I suppose we think automatically we're happy. Is that true in your thinking, your worldview, and what is that relationship between success and happiness?
Okay.
And
Great
how
que-
tough question. They wrote it. I didn't.
So, I like what President Cauce just said about the difference between happiness and having a happy life and having a meaningful life. Because happiness is really very much dependent on your physical, your vocational, your financial state. It's sort of a moment thing. I feel happy. But something deeper, having a sense of meaning, having a sense of wellness of the soul, we call it, is much more of a spiritual thing. And it is they're not necessarily the same. So when we look at someone who might be successful in many sort of measures of things having gone well in their lives, it is not a statement about wellness. And actually what we really want, in some sense, much of the research in this area is talking about meaning. And people discover that to find meaning, we actually have to have a bigger context. Meaning requires you to have a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. To be able to look backwards, forward, and outwards in order to know what meaning is. And so I think when I think about happiness, it is a very temporary state of feeling, mostly dependent on external things. When I think about wellness, I think of what Jesus says. Jesus says, blessed, meaning happy or blessed. Blessed are the poor, or poor in spirit, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are those who thirst and hunger after righteousness, for they will be satisfied. This blessedness is referring not so much to a temporary happiness, but it's a wellness, sort of a healthiness of the soul. Right? So I don't know if you have Kaiser Permanente here. Is this? No? So we
California
have
thing.
California thing. So it's this healthcare provider called Kaiser. And so their logo is, be well, thrive. Okay. So, and Stanford has a wellness plan. The idea is to be healthy, to be whole. And so now the real question to me is, what is it that keeps us from feeling whole? What is wrong? Why is it elusive? And you know, in the traditional Christian view, there are problems inside, which is that we have a need. We have a need to reach out to God, and when we do not have peace with God, we have these struggles. And so, so I have seen people who like my son he went to grad school, and he has a friend. She's a Christian, her Bible studies. She doesn't have a very happy family background. Her dad and mom are separated. Her dad is dating a 19-year-old who is expecting their first kid. The way she puts it is, family gatherings don't always go so well. But she really has what I would say a well soul. She's out there helping other people. She's reaching out. So it's not so much the environment oftentimes that determines this wellness. It has something to do with what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm. Anna-Marie, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, actually, there have been empirical studies on happiness, and they tend to find that a certain level of success, if you want to think about that, or a certain level of material comfort seems to be related to happiness. It's easy in some ways to say that poor people are happy until you're really poor, and if all you're thinking about is literally putting food on your table and where the next meal is going to go. I've worked a lot with 3 kids. That's not a real happy state. But once you get to a certain level, above that, there's no correlation, there's no relationship between, in that sense, happiness and success. And often you in fact see, you were talking about Palo Alto. I've got a friend who's a psychologist who has been doing some work over in Mercer Island, because you often see these very wealthy suburbs as in fact places with a lot of drug use, a lot of the kinds of things that would suggest that people are restless and not happy. And so to that degree, it really is important to realize that yes, some level of material comfort is probably necessary, but it's a relatively low level. What predicts to happiness above that really are the kinds of things that you were talking about, the kinds of things that have to do with a life that's meaningful, that sense of purpose, that you wake up in the morning and there's a reason why you're waking up, that you have plans, you have goals, and again, that those goals aren't just, happiness is a lot about the present, the moment. And meaning is really about putting together the past, the present, and the future. It's much more integrated. And I think that is what I think is worth, and that's what you should be really thinking about while you're in college, while you're studying, is it's all about, you're doing this for a future. And what do you want that future to look like? And it's more than just, where are you going to sit or what profession you're going to have, but what do you really want to do with your life? What do you care about? What fills you? What makes you whole? And I do think that sometimes we don't stop and think about those things. And sometimes it's very hard to talk about them because you can end up feeling kind of self-conscious or silly because as a society, we don't talk about them a lot. We talk a lot more about, the things that you want to possess. But I really think those are the kinds of conversations that you should be having with each other and that you should be thinking about, because I think at the end of the day, that's much more important than anything else. And you can do it from almost any position.
Okay, so what advice would you two give? Sorry.
What advice would you two give for undergraduates or graduates transitioning into the workforce? I think there's a lot of anxiety about those issues for a lot of students. So what resources, from your experience, would you give to young people transitioning from college, which is relatively safe, to a place of some anxiety, I think, for a lot of young people? Whoever, Charles, you want to? Tough questions, I know.
Okay, so let me try to address it this way. I recently was giving a talk down south with a group of people, and I had a question. One of the from the audience asked, what is the difference between going to church and a Carnegie Mellon course? Not Carnegie Mellon, a Dale Carnegie course. You guys familiar with Dale Carnegie course? Okay. So Dale Carnegie, how to win friends, influence people. It's self-help to help you do things. And at first, I didn't even make the connection. Why would there be a similarity? And then I started to realize that a lot of people think that, going to church is just like any other sort of self-help process. Basically, the idea is you meditate, you do certain things, and your life is better. So the pretext of this question is, how do I deal with this problem, which is the problem of trying to find a job, trying to sort of graduate first, I guess, and then going through this process. In fact, there is a bigger problem, which is, what are your eyes looking at? Where should the focus be? And so, my sincere response to this is, Dale Carnegie courses are great. They tell you, they help you to do certain things. Okay? But if your problem, your challenge is even deeper than that, if it has something to do with what you want, why you want it, and whether it is the best thing for you, then you have to look a little deeper than that. It's not a matter of trying to solve this problem of what the next, where my next bowl of rice, as we say in Chinese, comes from. Okay? It really is much. That's why Jesus says things like, do not worry. He said, therefore, do not worry. Why? Because look at the birds in the air, and look at the flowers in the fields. They don't do that. A lot of people misunderstand that passage. They look at that and they say, oh, God, what Jesus is saying is, don't worry, be happy. You don't have to plan. It's all going to work out. But that passage is in the context of this incredible talk about the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, why don't you worry about these things? He says, because your Heavenly Father knows about these things. He knows that you need it. Then he says, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and then all these things will be given to you as well. He's not saying these things are important. He's saying, you know what? The very fact that you ask me tonight that the most important thing is how do I get my job isn't quite framing it right. Not that it's not important, just as President Cauce said. It is extremely important, especially when you don't have one and you frankly have a big student loan and there's a lot of things. But it only goes so far. So tonight, I hope that if you came in here with this big worry about where you find a job, one thing I would say is stop for a moment and ask, what are the most fundamental questions I would ask as a human being? For me, a lot of this comes out of the whole Genesis narrative of a man. You know about the tree and how they ate. And the first thing that happened is that their eyes were open. And what happened next? They saw they were naked. This is a very fundamental issue because it has to do with why your resume is so important to you. They saw they were naked. So then God walks in the cool of the garden, you know the story, and then God looks out and says, where are you? And man is tucked away somewhere, and he says, I'm afraid because I'm naked, so I hid. That is an amazing universal and declaration. Fear, I'm afraid because I'm naked. Shame, because I don't feel adequate. And hiding, denial. This says, I'm going to do something about this, and the way to do it is I'm just not going to let you see it. It does not matter what your religion is. It does not matter what your culture is. There is no place I know where the human mind does not understand those three emotions of fear, of shame, and of denial, of hiding. So when you ask, how do I get my job? An even deeper question is, how did I get to the point where my job is so important to me? Which is what Jesus was trying to say. He is not saying that he doesn't know. He's saying that you don't know. You don't know what is potentially the most important thing. And he says, if you sought the most important thing, you will discover the other stuff falls into place. You have the center of the wheel, everything else is a spoke. But you put the wrong thing in the middle, things don't turn so well. I'm not saying how to enhance your resume is not important. We have classes on this stuff. We sweat over this stuff. I'm saying, though, for a moment, ask yourself, suppose I were to relax the constraints of my job and other things, what would I really ask about life? And there, you might find that the voice that comes from these very old books tell you something.
Yeah, I think that what you said is, right on target. I'd put it in some ways the same thing, but put it a little bit differently, which is your life has already started, and start your life today. I think that there's a way where sometimes as we're chasing the next step, oh, well, I'm going to do this now, and then, when I graduate and I have a job, then I'll worry about whether it's, being involved in a meaningful relationship or, finding something else that you really care about. Or I see it all the time, assistant professors, well, what do I have to do to get tenured? And then when I'm tenured, and you go, gee, by the time you're there, how much of your life will you have wasted getting to the next step? This is your real life. And, one of the things that we've been working a lot on here at the University of Washington is trying to get our students to get involved in more than the classroom and think about the other activities, the other ways of connecting, the other kinds of leadership activities, the other ways in which you can give to your community. And that starts now. It's not something that starts when you graduate or after you graduate. You know, I spent a lot of time struggling on whether I wanted to be a psychologist or I wanted to be a lawyer. I could have been happy doing both, and probably regardless of which one I took, I'd probably be a professor. And because it really was for me, you know, my driving motivation, I wanted to be a teacher ever since I was about that old. And, you know, we kind of think if I don't find just the right thing, and often, you know, just the right thing is what you make of it, not necessarily, it's not some mystical. If I don't pick the right thing, I won't be happy. Make whatever you pick something meaningful, because it really is all the other things that you do. And stop waiting for your real life to begin. It has begun. And if you're not making something of it now, getting a job isn't going to change that.
Preach it.
All right.
Okay. Last question. Discovery is at the heart of our university. So in a way, we should be open to change. And so this is a tough question.
The other ones have all been very easy.
Yeah, right. Puck balls.
I did not write these. What would cause you, would cause you to change your worldview, your point of view, or maybe even also what has caused you to change in the past? Either one, or both. Who wants to go now?
Some people think, and I have a friend who's a fly fisherman. We go fly fishing quite a bit. He's another professor, a very analytical guy. And he told me one day, he said, you know, faith is this blind thing, right? You just believe or you don't believe. He just says, you know, if it isn't blind, it isn't faith, right? And I said, well, it's not the way I look at it. Because faith, to me, is evidence-based. It is not absolute the way we talk about a mathematical proof. Right? A mathematical proof is you start with some axioms, you follow some irrefutable laws of logic, and you get to an inescapable conclusion. Right? That's proof. Now, when it comes to a lot of what I believe, it isn't quite like that. You can't prove a lot of the most important things in your life, like your relationships. I can't mathematically prove that my wife is the right gal for me. But I'm betting. Lily, if you're watching, I'm just making a point here. But I'm betting my whole life on it, right? I'm betting my whole life. I cannot mathematically prove every time I get on a plane that it will take me from here to there, but I'm betting my whole life on it. Most of the important things in your life will be decided under uncertainty. In fact, under certainty, we all do the same thing. Okay? So under uncertainty is when you discover who you are. And in your relationships, in your moral choices, particularly in your relationship with God, right? Weight of evidence is very important to me. So if the weight of evidence tells me that what I believe is wrong, I would want to change. And in particular, very important to me are some of the historic claims about this person who claimed that he is God incarnate and did some amazing things and then died. If the evidence says that he did not do that, if the evidence says that he was not resurrected in particular, then I think I would change how I believe. But the fact, if I believe that what he did was real, is real, then the implications for why I'm here changes radically. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does. Okay. Change. Can you change? Have you changed?
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that we know as psychologists by asking people to tell narratives of their life is that looking backwards, we tend to see a lot of constancy. So, you know, if you asked me to tell the narrative of my life, there wouldn't be a lot of sharp turns. Yet, when I think about different points of my life, I thought about things very differently than I do now. I mean, I think for me, a lot of what shapes my worldview is really my parents and, you know, the immigration story. My parents were very successful and fairly wealthy people in Cuba. My father was Minister of Education. And after the revolution, he swept floors and made shoes. My mother and father worked in a factory, and we grew up fairly poor. And that, but, you know, this is one of the things of why I believe so much in education. I think that it wasn't that my parents really taught me the importance of honest work, and that there's no honest work that's beneath anybody. But also, like, my dad had this whole other life in terms of particularly interested in educating Cuban children about their culture and history, because he felt that was important to their self-esteem, also because he felt we might go back any moment, which, you know, a number of years after that, that didn't exactly happen, but it was a way in which his life was much more than his job. And I look at that and I see how much that shaped me. But I can tell you at various points along the way, I thought that being Cuban was something that you didn't want to be, and that it was kind of, you know, pushing you to the past rather than the future. And so, you know, I think in various ways I can see there's various times when everything from my faith to my love, including for my parents, has been tested. But from this point, what I see is the continuity. But I think at various points, it seemed like it could have gone a different way.
That's beautiful. Thank you to both of you. Let's give them a hand real quick. So I think we're going to have questions from the audience, right?
Yeah. Okay. So some people texted their questions in. I don't know who's I wanted to thank you both for coming here tonight. And the first question that was texted in was, if we are more than our resumes and we as human beings have limited time in our lives, what does that mean for who you want to be and what you want to do?
More tough questions. Good grief.
So you're asking, I guess the question is, on a personal basis, who do you want to be and what do you want to do? Okay, so I'm, you know, I turned 57 last year. How much longer do we have here? It has been said that you never step in the same river twice, because every time you walk in, it's a different river, right? And in campus, more than any other place, you sense this, because this gathering will never happen again the way it's happened, right? And when I look at this, I say to myself, you know, life is really short here. For all its beauty and its brevity, it's very short. But I don't think this is the end. I think this is just the beginning. So there is a ways to go. And God is very patient with me. So my goal is to try to make newer mistakes as I keep bumping along, and to try to figure out what else I should be doing. This is a very short time. I'm not thinking about my legacy when I die. I'm thinking about where things should go in the next many years ahead.
I'll take the next one. How about that?
We have one more here. What is the basis for teaching ethics in the workforce when there's no agreement on an objective morality? In other words, if postmodernism is the starting point, how can we build a coherent, livable way of doing ethical business?
Okay, so that was an easy one for me. You know, I mean, sometimes I think that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And, you know, I mean, there are some constants in terms of ethics. And they are real. I think the postmodern, can only go so far. I think that, as I was saying before, I think that there's various aspects of moral codes that are pretty universal. I also think that in an odd sort of way that ethics are actually also good business. And that's something that's taught in business schools. Because partly, if part of how you make decisions, and your generation does so even more because you grew up being able to read commercials and look through them more so than mine did, is that we see time and again, especially right now, people voting with their feet for businesses that they think are more ethical. Sustainability is something that more and more businesses are doing, not necessarily because of a deep moral compass, although I'd like to think that's part of it, but also because it influences whether you're going to buy from them or not. Look what happened in Indiana. It was corporations that made that law change because people like you weren't going to put up with it. And so, I really think that it's not good business or profits or ethics. I really think that there's a real intersection there, and that that us as consumers can make a difference in terms of ethical business behavior. So, I'm not going to agree with the premise of the question.
Good. Next question.
Okay, so the next question from the audience is for both of you. It says, how have you both sought to challenge the perceptions in your field which misconstrue the meaning of humanity and success?
Whoa.
Wow, man. Wow.
Yeah, well, I could try that. All right. So my field. So I graduated out of seminary, and then I went into my PhD program in economics and accounting. So the very first 2 weeks of my PhD existence, what I was taught were what the economists consider axioms. In other words, the foundations of our craft. And these axioms all have to do with this creature called the rational man. And the rational man, savage axioms rationality, basically says you have infinite processing power, you have a variety of characteristics, many of which I did not find descriptive, especially coming out of Genesis 3 and the stuff I just learned. And so my intuition was, a lot of the social science, the main difference between social science and physical science is what you need to assume about the nature of man. And when you don't get the nature of man right, you're going to get some predictions that are going to look weird, including things like efficiency of markets without any help, including, which is an area that I've done a lot of research in. So as an example, as an ideology, capitalism is a great ideology. Those of you who are from China, wei ren ming fu, the idea is you serve the others. The common good is the key. So we all agree, but that doesn't get us there. So what is it that's keeping us from getting there? Whereas, what we have in a lot of in Western countries, the idea is, the human being is sort of just a human being, and you got to recognize that God is God and we're not, and let's have some checks and balances since by nature, we are in need of that. In fact, we acknowledge it. So to deal with, for me, a lot of the research that I've done has come directly out of my sense about the nature of man and why some of the economic predictions don't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think my field is kind of all over the place. There certainly are psychologists who look at us as basically, bundles of firing neurons, and anything that you might call faith or meaning, etc., is epiphenomenon. It comes from, that it's not real, it's just a little bit random, and, you can do things, I don't know if any of you have heard of superstitious behavior, but basically you can get things like pigeons to do funny dances by reinforcing them in odd ways. And so there are some folks who would say that all of what we've been talking about is superstitious behavior. But I also think that there's a real part of my profession, and I'd say that I'm part of that take the notion of meaning very, very seriously. And that notion of happiness, the whole area that we call positive psychology, that is, let's get beyond the absence of the negative, because in fact, often meaning and anxiety and worry go together. Part of developing a philosophy of life usually does come often out of negative experiences, from experiencing the death of someone that you love, which then makes you think about what does this mean and what do you want out of your life and what would happen if you were hit by a truck tomorrow? Would you feel that how you spent today was worthwhile? And so I do think that there is that part of my field that takes these questions very seriously. And it's not just going to be about how does it look when you take in essence, a snapshot of your brain, and that it's not just about firing neurons, but it's about the way that we make sense of our lives.
All right, so the next question that was texted in is, why Christianity? Isn't any religion or spiritual path equally useful?
Oh, okay. I guess that, you want to feel that? No.
That question
I'll
is
do
more
that.
for him
Yes,
than for me.
okay. So I would tell you why I find my faith very satisfying, structured. The biggest challenge for me, so when I talk to my friends who have different faith persuasions, and I actually have friends who believe almost anything you can think of, many times the serious ones would agree on the ailments. So we recognize some of the things that we ought to do. Okay? We recognize that self-control is a challenge, some problems we have. The difference, and we actually also recognize that teaching ethics and teaching how we behave civilly as a society, how we as a community should behave, is a good thing. But at the very root, the reason why I am a Christian for me is that the Christian focus is very much on the loving relationship. So relationship is core to the Christian faith. And what it says is that the most important relationship is your relationship with God. The personhood and love of God is really core to this faith. And in fact, it says that it's very, very difficult for us to talk in terms of love when we talk about love is relational, right? We acknowledge that the chair and I don't have much of love in between. It's between beings.
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, I sort of love this chair, but the reality is that it's responsive, it's relational. And in Christianity, what we saw in the incarnation of Christ is an understanding of what love is from God's perspective that is very hard to get from any other sort of, for me, way of looking. And the only way I know how anyone ever loved me was the cost they paid for me. If you think about your life, who do you know has loved you? And why? It's almost always because somebody paid a cost for you. In fact, why do the Christians say God is love? Because there's this graphic image of this guy hanging on a cross, praying for the forgiveness of those who are doing it. It's a very different view from what I have seen elsewhere. So we say.
Okay.
I can take that.
Yeah.
I think that, to come at it from a slightly different perspective, I have an enormous amount of respect for people who have faith, and not just respect, I kind of envy someone that really does have the kind of belief that you do. I think it's a gift. It's not a gift that I have. I still, for a long time, I think that part of why I studied Eastern religions in college, et cetera, is I was searching. At this point, I'm not sure I'd consider myself actively searching, in part because I'm not sure it would make a big difference in terms of the way that I live my life. And what I mean by that is that I do all the things that you're talking about, the importance of love, the importance of compassion, the importance of giving back, those things that, like I say, I think really are standard across religions. In my family, there's Catholics, there's Jewish, there's those folks that are kind of somewhere in between. And I think that the way we live our lives is in fact very similar. And I think that that's what's important to me, is that sense of spirit, the getting beyond yourself, the we is greater than me, that I think is just so incredibly important. And I think it's important that we all find something that can guide us and take us out of ourselves.
Yeah, right. So, right.
Okay. You want two more questions? Okay.
So you guys have talked a lot about living a life of meaning. What meaning or purpose do you see in the life of a person who's critically ill or has no ability to live in a functional way?
Question. Oh, can I go?
You want to go?
Okay. You want to go?
No, I don't. I asked the questions.
So did you all hear it? What meaning is there in a person who is critically ill or so I strongly, I strongly, and I tell them, strongly believe that human beings have intrinsic value. Okay, so intrinsic value is not the same as functional value. Functional value is what a person could do for you, right? Intrinsic value is just intrinsic, image of God type of endowment. Okay, and intrinsic value is not commercial value. Commercial value is probably measured by, I don't know, your collection of bitcoins or your resume or something, right? Intrinsic value is just because they are a human being, they have value. Now, there are some worldviews from which this is a natural derivative. There are others that are not. The Christian worldview, to me, this is a very natural derivative. Why else would God come and die for me? Obviously, he thinks I'm worth something. And obviously, he thinks the same of you. Before I was a Christian, I thought of, and everybody has different backgrounds and different views. But before I was a Christian, just to generalize, there are two types of people. People who are kind of better than me, however you measure the scale, and people who are worse than me. And the people who are better than me sort of intimidate me. The people who are worse than me, well, they kind of make me feel smug. After I became a Christian, there were only two types of people. Those, in Chinese, we say 可爱的, and those 可怜的. Okay, so it means that those who are just lovable, or those who are, I don't want to use the word pitiful. What I mean is those who need compassion. Okay, this is reality. I think this is the way God looks at us. I think that when God looks at us, that's what he sees, and he sees more than what's on your resume. He sees what is in your heart, what you're striving to be, what you have aspired to become. And he will look in that heart and he will. That's why Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. He just says, I see your heart and I know what you want. And I totally agree with President Cauce. It was a gift. I mean, my becoming a Christian was a gift. And I just pray that gift you will experience.
I'm not going to go into a lengthy answer because we want one more question, but I think that sometimes in our society we devalue suffering. And what we tend to do whenever there's any kind of suffering, the first place we go is to escape it. And I actually think that there is some real value in experiencing our own pain, because it often is redemptive. It often does lead us to a different understanding in a different place. I think that sometimes I work a lot with parents. It's like guiding, trying to protect their child from any kind of failure, any kind of hurt, and that's not how you build strength. And so I think that, there is some value in suffering. We can argue and as to at what point, if what you're talking about, if the question seemed to be, when do we continue to intervene to keep someone alive or not? I was with both my parents when they died in hospice, in a Catholic hospice, in both cases. So there were limits, but I also, because we had those conversations, particularly my father died first with my mom, as to how much we would do to keep her alive. And there were choices that I made, because it fell to me, about not doing some things that some other people would have done. But I also would not have interfered with death the way maybe some other people would.
Okay, thank you. One last question.
So the last question is, how do we find a passion in this economically driven society when we often find ourselves pressured by the society and the success is measured by the school we attend, the car we drive, or the position we hold?
Another easy one.
Well, I drive a 2005 Honda Civic. You can go see it in the garage.
Wow.
My next car will be a Prius. You know, I mean, actually, one of the hardest parts of this job is that I have to look nice every day. and for me, that's not always easy. Or the best use of the first half hour of the day, might I say. You know, I just think that you have to, that it's not how other people see you, or basically, or particularly how other people who don't know you see you. And I just, I don't think that's where you're going to find happiness or meaning or any of those things that are really going to make you the kind of person you want to be. Those are just outside markers. For some people, I'm not going to put anyone down if they really care about cars. I spend way more money on books than maybe some other people do. So it's not like I'm going to, make a judgment on someone about that, but I think that at the end of the day, that's not what it's all about.
So, my daughter, when she was 5 or 6 years old, came and sat on my lap. She looked in my eyes. She stared me in the face, and she said, "I can see myself in your eyes." She, I thought, was saying something much deeper than she knew. We often, if in the absence of God, we look into the eyes of those around us, and our lives are shaped by those who chose to love us and refused to love us, and those whose reflections we liked and did not like, and we'd like to spend more time staring into the eyes of those who love us. But somewhere along the way, by the grace of God, we stare into a pair of eyes and we say to ourselves, wow, that's the real me. And, it has a lot of blemishes. In fact, it's much uglier than I thought. But through those eyes, I'm all right.
Yeah, it really is interesting. I mean, I do think that at this age, you do get bombarded much more by those messages of how do you look, et cetera. I actually feel much better about how I look now than I did at your age, and I was more attractive at your age than I am now. But and so I do think it's very hard, and so I don't mean to be dismissive when I say that you have to get beyond that. I do think it's very hard because you are bombarded by those messages, but to some degree you also can choose to be bombarded a little bit less. I'd say the first step is spend a little bit less time on your phones and spend a little bit more time looking around you. I mean, we live in a very beautiful part of the world. I had never hiked before I came out here. Go out and walk someplace beautiful. I mean, just walking by, the Arboretum. I often park at the other side of the Montlake Fill and walk up. In the morning, there's birds all over the place. This is actually a really nice time for birds because the migrations are coming. Just look around. And when you look outside, you get beyond the latest fashion because it's not anywhere near as beautiful as the feathers on a sparrow.
That's good.
Yeah.
Can we just give our presenters, our moderator, just another round of applause? Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.